Today, I'm your host on the Privacy Insider podcast. We'll be talking with Dr. Michael Hemenway. Michael is a director of design and data science at theological institutions. Specifically, he's at the Association of Theological Schools, and he is a research associate at Case Western Reserve University in their H Lab. He blends technology and theology. He specializes in data integration, natural language processing, org design, instructional design, and ethical practices around the use and development of artificial intelligence. Michael is also the co-founder of the Experimental Humanities Lab and the Artificial Intelligence Institute at the Iliff School of Theology. He's working with Dr. Timothy Beal, Google, and National Humanities Centers on the Responsible Artificial Intelligence Curriculum Design product. Michael, welcome to the show. It's great to have you.
Thanks, Arlo. It's good to be here.
Well, we're really excited about today's episode. We've always been historically chatting with people who are, deep in the weeds of regulation. So lots of attorneys and privacy professionals. And I'm really excited to have you here today because one of the big topics that we should be talking about, if we're not talking about it already, is ethics in AI. I am really interested in understanding what a theological institute has to do with AI. But before we jump into that topic, would you mind telling us just a little bit about your background?
I come out of a science background. I was a chemistry undergrad student, and then decided to go to grad school first in chemistry to, explore electrons and quantum mechanics and all that. And yet, my background, I have a lot of church, and I was born to a Presbyterian minister. My dad was a pastor. And although I didn't live with him too long, parents divorced pretty early. And so then grew up kind of without a dad around, and found a lot of connection through church and religion and faith and things like that to men and father figures and things like that. So when I got to graduate school, I thought, I don't know that I want to spend my life in a lab. And so I left a PhD program in chemistry to go work in a church, running a music program. And then from that, I ended up in seminary, getting a degree in New Testament studies and then another degree in theology and religion. And so it's kind of it's an interesting path coming from chemistry into the theological world, and then from there ending up in data science. And I've been doing technology and data science for the last, I don't know, 20 years.
That's a really unusual and very interesting background. It's cool how people end up in all things AI and privacy and ethics. There's not a real linear path, it seems. But definitely the first person I met who has been part of seminary and now has gone into privacy. So just kind of goes to show there's no direct path into privacy. Well, I'd love to learn a little bit about the where you see the overlap of AI and theology, because this is not an overlap in the Venn diagram that many people think of. And so what does the Theological Institute do, and how does that relate in any way to AI?
Yeah, that's a great question, Arlo. And I think we get it a lot at Iliff when we're working with companies and organizations around like, yeah, what are you doing here, actually? And I think the way it sort of started was Iliff School of Theology, where the Innovation Lab is located, which is where this work around AI ethics happens. Iliff has for a long time historically been very deeply involved in social justice issues, in issues of societal ethics, and even science and ethics as a part of its history. And so it actually internally, we were like, this makes total sense to us. Right. We have a long history as a school of training leaders to really be invested in how ethics has an impact on concrete practice like science and AI. And I just so happened to have a friend of mine in the PhD program we were in there, both of us very interested in data science. And so as we were finishing our degrees, we were both working there as technologists as well. I was in the database area, and he was doing programming. We started the Experimental Humanities Lab there, which started to explore how data science and machine learning might intersect with studying ancient languages and ancient texts around the practice of religion. And then from there, we thought, and this was, like a decade ago, right? So from there, we thought, this AI thing is becoming a kind of an important thing. And we don't see a whole lot of folks talking about the ethics of this. And we actually have a lot to say about the ethics of these sorts of things. And so we started having conversations with particularly startups early on about like, hey, what's your plan to sort of address the ethical questions around implementing AI, developing AI, the communities that will be impacted by the AI that you're putting into practice, those sorts of things. And the startups were like, well, we don't have a plan. We'd love to have a conversation about it. Again, this was a decade ago. People have better plans now, but they're like, we'd love to have a plan, but we don't have time and we don't have money. So can you help us not get sued? So the conversations around ethics got really focused on managing litigation, right? And we're not lawyers at Iliff, and so we quickly pivoted from talking explicitly about ethics more to talking about trust, right? And how trust is at the root of the communities of practice that will be using these tools and that will be impacted by these tools. And so we built a model around this idea of trust, and everything in machine learning, right, is an acronym, right? So trust for us means transparency, responsibility, user-centeredness, sustainability, and team. And so we built a whole model around that to actually invite organizations into conversations around alignment of their values with their implementation or design of AI tools. And that values alignment felt to us to be really rooted in the theological discourse, right? I mean, this is part of what people are looking for when they participate in a religious community or a community of faith is some kind of values alignment. And so we've kind of been invested in this values alignment stuff for a long time, and we thought we were bringing that to the table in terms of the AI conversation.
When we think about AI and ethics, I think one question that a lot of people will have who are listening is what is the difference between ethics and values? Is there a difference? And when you think about AI and technology, where does the ethical component come in? Where do you, when you get brought in, is it questions about, hey, I want to take lots of data and sell it to the Chinese government. Is that okay? Or is it conversations? I mean, what kinds of things are people asking questions about? So that was really a couple of questions: ethics versus value.
I'll take the ethics and the values question first. I think hopefully they're quite related. But I think in our practice, ethics actually leans more toward putting values into practice, especially in decision making, right? So oftentimes we get invited in the conversation at some part of the stage where people are trying to make decisions. Sometimes they're procurement decisions, right? Sometimes they're deployment decisions, right? And sometimes they're decisions about what kind of teams they need to build, what kinds of culture they're trying to build in their organizations around these sorts of things. But the ethics tends to be more intimately connected to the decision making process, not just, hey, what do we think is good or what do we think is great, but how do we put to work the things that we value in that sense. And so values should guide ethics in that sense. That's so I think that's how we talk about the relationship between the two. When we've been invited in the process is often either when an organization is first considering whether they want to implement a tool or not. And the two main concerns that usually get us at the table are um, how are we going to build a team that has the diversity we need in order to help us implement and or develop these tools in a way that's responsible, right? That's one thing that tends to bring us to the table. And the other is, what's the impact going to be on our communities? right? And this is where trust becomes critical, right? So we think trust is the bottom line. Trust with your employees, trust with your customers, trust with your stakeholders, board members, things like this, right? And so I think a lot of times when companies or organizations are like, we really need to have a good handle on our implementation or use of AI and its impact on the trust of our communities. How could this potentially harm folks that we are working with? And we don't want to do that. We want to get out ahead of that. And so that's where the kind of ethics of decision making come in.
I mean, you mentioned laws, right? People are asking in concert. We went in to talk about ethics. It turned out that they wanted to actually know about regulations, right? Which is another interesting. I don't get a lot of professors on the show, so I guess my question really is, what came first, the law or the ethics? Because I think we would all agree that the law and ethics are not always the same, but I would love to understand how you differentiate and kind of the chicken or egg, right? Did we have rules and then we said, hey, those are the rules and we're going to internalize those values? Or did we have those values and use ethics to determine our laws? Or not, or none of the above, I guess, would be option number C.
Not being a historian, I don't know that I can speak much to all of history around which came first. I bet, though, if we looked, we would see it happening both directions at different times, depending on kind of cultural context and milieu. I think what I would hope for, and the way that I hear conversations happening right now in the AI space, is that the ethics are the primary thing, and we want to build regulation and laws to help support the protection of those values, right? So that the ethics is built on a set of values that a society shares. And we may get into this more later, but the tricky part with ethics, right, is whose ethics, right? How large is the community that's agreeing on this shared value, right? I mean, that's been a historic problem in terms of communities relating to each other as globalization has become a thing. That's a tricky part of how you negotiate both what ethics do and to whom, and how you build regulation around that, because what's the purview of both the ethical framework and of the legal framework that then supports that. So that's how I approach my work, is that I think regulation in the AI space, I'm sure in the privacy space too, regulation is critical. It's an important piece of how we are as a society are going to it. I think that regulation is important. Um, it's an important piece of how we're going to do this as a society, but I don't think regulation comes first. I think regulation supports the values of a society that then drives the ethical framework that's guiding decision making.
That sounds good to me. I'll have to take your word on it, though. So, you talk about ethics, you talk about AI, and, I start thinking a little bit about things like the singularity. What is Ray Kurzweil, I think, has been predicting the singularity for 50 years now. And every couple of years, it gets moved another 10 years out. But this time, I'm wondering if he might be right. And we certainly are seeing AI become very powerful in its predictive capabilities. I believe I just read last week that a team of researchers have managed to show through using ML that evolution is not all random. And in fact, it's much more predictable than we think it is, but the patterns are incredibly complex that humans can't see. And so now machines have looked at this and said, oh, we can predict the next protein that will evolve out of this cell, which is pretty amazing. And it starts making me wonder, are we playing God? Are humans getting too smart? And so I'm very interested in some bigger topics, but I think the first thing that would be really helpful to understand would be, what does it even mean to be human these days? If I can get on a phone call with my bank and have an entire conversation with a machine, but not realize it's a machine, I just thought I talked to a person. I gave them some of my soul, for lack of a better word, right? I had a conversation. Hello, how are you? Turns out they're not real. I'm really interested in your thoughts on that, in terms of, what does it mean to be human, and are we playing God?
Those are easy questions. So we'll just knock those off real fast. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's a question we often get, particularly the one about what does it mean to be human? And I think there are a number of folks who would articulate that at its best, that's what theology is after. Theology is really asking the question about what it means to be human in a universe, in a cosmos. A reason why theology might have something to say to these things or might be pertinent to this conversation is, what does it mean to be human in a larger framework, a larger complex system that we call a universe or a cosmos, right? So I think I love the question. I think it's an interesting question. I think we've been asking the question for a very long time. What's interesting is that I don't know that we've wondered too much about it over the last couple of hundred of years, right? We sort of have had a kind of stable sense of what human was and how it was different than all the other things. And what we have used to determine that difference was a narrow notion of cognitive capacity, right? That's often how we differentiated humans from other species, from the earth and land and rocks, from other kinds of material things that are non-human. I think we got pretty comfortable with that as I'm a human because, I mean, think about Descartes, right? I think, therefore I am, right? So it's this particular cognitive capacity of mine that makes me human. Now, there's a whole strand of philosophy that are like, that's nonsense. That's not actually what it means to be human. There's other things that are driving that. That's fine. But what I find really interesting is I think artificial intelligence has raised this question in a new way because it's threatening that notion of our exceptionalism, that particular narrow notion of our exceptional cognitive capacity in this one band, right? As you even said, like there are complex patterns in the organic world that machines seem to be able to handle better than we can. Uh-oh. If my value proposition in the world was this particular cognitive capacity as a human, and that's what made me unique as a human, then what now? It's the same with creativity. If we think about generative AI, and one of the things that people get really concerned about generative AI is its creative capacity, right? We think, oh, what makes us human is we can create things that don't have a usefulness in the world. They're just beautiful. We create them, and we create them because they're fun to create, and because we want to create, and because that's just what humans do out of our excess of whatever, And as we see generative AI have creative capacities, again, we say, uh-oh, what is it then that makes humans humans and not machines and or not something else? And so I think it's interesting that I think AI right now has made this question more pertinent than it has been in the past. And that's one of the reasons I think this technological movement is different than earlier technological movements. They all have a threat in some way to how we feel like we relate to the world. But this one's particularly tense because it's challenging that thing we thought made us exceptional.
I remember taking a college class, and it was a psychology course, and it was one of the intro courses. But they were talking about one of the tests that they have is what makes humans superior or more intellectual than another species. And so the test was always to say humans are the only animal that can fill in the blank, right? And for a long time, it was humans are the only animal that can talk. And then, gosh, it turns out the gorillas talked, and lots of animals communicate, and we had to go scratch that off the list. And now it sounds like we're going to have to take off. Humans are the only creature that creates art. We're going to have to go scratch that off the list now, although AI is not exactly a creature yet. Do you think there's any cognitive dissonance here? Right? I mean, we are, as human beings, we've been told, here's what makes you human. And then I see an AI do that same thing. And of course, I feel some fear, some revulsion, but I can't help but wonder if deep down inside it's that I had a belief that is foundational. And now that belief is being challenged, and I have to either pretend it doesn't exist, or I have to figure out how to get over it and find a new way to define what makes me humanity. Do you think that has anything to do with this?
I 100% think that has a lot to do with this. And I mean, this is the challenge. And one of the challenges we're trying to work on at the Innovation Lab is helping communities not return to old patterns when this cognitive dissonance appears. The typical human response to this cognitive dissonance around difference that feels like it's better, or just difference in general, our human tendency is to domesticate that. We try to come up with ways to make that thing smaller or more contained so that humans can stay at the top of the food chain. We've done this with particular people groups historically, right? We've done this with the environment historically. We've done it in all kinds of contexts, right? And I don't think AI is much different in terms of what our default response as humans would be is, how do we domesticate this thing? I mean, look at the news. That's what the news is trying to say is, how do we keep this thing in the box, right? So that it cannot, and back to your singularity point, right, of Kurzweil's, right? How do we make sure this thing can't be on top of the food chain where we should sit, right? So we're trying really hard to maintain that kind of dominion and exceptionalism, and so yes, I think there's dissonance, and I'm not sure societally that we have developed more robust and sustainable ways to address that dissonance that aren't as damaging as dominion has been.
Yeah, human beings are exceptionally bad at forecasting abstract things, right? I guess it's this, like you're talking about with the environment. It's the very reason why the environment is a problem right now, because I wake up and I can't really see the problem. It is not visible, but I do need to make sure I eat and sleep and have shelter. And so I'm always going to focus on those things that are kind of a clear and present focus rather than those abstract things. And it feels like AI and technology kind of fall into that bucket. So I mentioned the word soul when I was talking about kind of having conversations with AI bots that I didn't know were AI. And I would be very interested in understanding, do you differentiate between that concept of kind of what makes us human and the concept of what is a soul? Or is that one and the same question, or are those two very different questions?
I think there are a lot of folks who deal with that differently. If you're asking me, Arlo, uh, I think the question about what it means to be human needn't really involve a question about the soul if a particular community doesn't think soul is a useful category. So I would just say that. So I don't think that soul needs to be a part of the conversation. What I do think is interesting about soul, yeah, I do think there are many traditions for whom soul is a critical part of what it means to be human, and what even would differentiate a human from other species of animals, other, that sort of thing, right? I wonder if what we're talking about when we talk about soul is, what is that thing about, let's just say, humans that isn't reducible to either our material body or to our mind, right? And let's think of our mind as a material body. We can make them one thing, right? But what is this thing that we have imagined about ourselves? And typically, soul is thought as an independent individual thing, right? I mean, there are some contexts in which there's a collective notion of soul, but certainly in the West, soul is an individualized thing. And I wonder, I mean, I wonder if the question comes from a place of what is the thing that exceeds my materiality.
I think that in some ways, what we're really talking about is transcendence, right? And and maybe we're using the word soul, and perhaps I'm using the word soul to really mean something different, but it's really kind of that non-physical, right? What is that thing that takes us beyond? And uh, is transcendence a piece here? I mean, when you think about transcendence and the soul, are these totally separate? Do they overlap?
I think they do. I absolutely, and I think you kind of named it, Arlo. I think that soul is a kind of an expression of transcendence at the individual level, right? If we think of transcendence as the process or the idea of something that exceeds a material reality or even exceeds our current ability to conceive of things, right? Then perhaps the soul is that thing that transcends death or my bodily existence or something like that. So and what's interesting, right? Again, with the AI space is and Kurzweil and these folks, some people are asking for machines to be their avenue toward transcendence. Put my brain, intelligence, my all of my thinking, this thing, put it into a computer, right? Upload my brain being into a computer so that when my body dies, I continue to exist. So there's whole movements about this.
I've actually been thinking a lot about that. I know Reid Hoffman, the founder of LinkedIn, has been playing around with a concept called Read.ai, where he has a little more money than we do. And so, he has a team of people helping him to virtualize himself, but he's doing it all anchored against the date on which he founded LinkedIn. So that's the cutoff date for knowledge. And they used his video to simulate him and his voice records to create his voice, and it is stunning. You can sit and watch Reid of 2024 have a conversation with Reid from 2002, and it is extraordinary. And it really does beg the question of like, well, which one is Reid? If they both think they're Reid and they both say they're Reid, how do we know that they're not both Reid? Um, so AI is going to present a huge number of interesting challenges. And I'm curious, you talked about ethics and the work that you do. Are there any specific kind of golden rules that we think about in terms of AI, especially when you're coaching people on how to make the right decisions and build that trust? I know at Asana we have our versions, but are there any kind of general rules of thumb that you use as being the calculus?
We tend to not work in golden rules, Arlo, because we tend to believe that ethics get put into practice in local communities, and local communities need to decide what the values alignment will look like with their practice. And so we tend not to begin with here are the five steps to responsible AI, right? There's a lot of those out there. I mean, people are offering those for sure. But so I don't think we work with golden rules. I don't know that I have any great ones there. Um, but I do think actually trust as a framework is as close as we would get to a golden rule. And in its acronym sense, right? Thinking about, you know, are you being transparent, right? And what does transparency mean in your context, right? Have you taken seriously responsibility, potential harms, right? And bias, right? Are you user centered in the way in which you approach the way in which you're using or building AI, right? Do you take sustainable approaches? What's your impact on the environment, right? I mean, sustainability is an important thing. And what kind of team are you building and cultivating in order to do this work? I do think that's still the best framework, even if it's not a golden rule on how to make the decision, it's the best framework I've seen in terms of how to build a process for a particular community to make a decision.
Interesting. Yeah. At Osana, we talk about our three simple ways of thinking about data, right? And the first question is you have to ask permission before you take. The second one we talk about is that if somebody wants it back, you have to give it back to them. And then third one is if they want to know where you're keeping it, you have to tell the truth. And that is a very simplified approach to privacy. But at the end of the day, we always try to distill things. But it sounds like with AI right now, that's a fairly difficult task because there's a lot of unknowns. So when you think about privacy as an example, right? We talk about the origins of privacy, and we say, okay, great. We can look at things like castle doctrine, the right to be forgotten after you've committed a crime some years ago. There are some basis in history for us to look at when it comes to things like privacy and technology. I'm curious whether you think historically we have anything that we can look back on as a guidepost for AI and AI governance, and as it relates to ethics. So given I know we're not going to distill it into three bullets. However, when you think about that history, right, is there anything that you can think of that we would anchor on as being like, well, this happened and here's how society responded and it worked well. We might want to replicate that.
My quick response would be yes, I absolutely believe that history ought to inform how we do governance, how we regulate, how we consider even the social impact of these tools, because this is not the first technological change that we've encountered. AI isn't. It won't be the last one. And there are a lot of things that are things we have encountered before as society that we can lean on and learn from the wisdom of history and the past and things like that. So I certainly think as a practice, yes, we ought to do that. In terms of particulars, I don't know that I have any good frameworks for where we would even begin. There's some folks who think about AI regulation a little bit like nuclear regulation in that sort of context, in terms of like, well, let's just make sure none of us are doing it at this level, right? And then we'll be okay, right? Or that we all have the tools and we've agreed not to use them, that kind of thing, rather than some other more particular regulation. Uh, the thing that I would want for us, Arlo, as a society, is to move toward a kind of governance and regulation that really did take the local seriously, that took community involvement and grassroots approaches really seriously, and started from there around, okay, what does a particular community want to say? These are our golden rules, right? This is the data that is okay to be used and not okay to be used, right? And then build from there. The harder part, I think, is how do those local community frameworks then get networked? There's this great cli-fi novel called A Half-Built Garden, that it's set in like 50 years in the future, maybe 80 years in the future, and I won't give you the whole premise, but the framework of the Earth at that point, right, it's a collection of watersheds, local watersheds that build their own local stability as a community, and then they built these really intricate, complicated networks between the watersheds that have um, complicated negotiation structures for them to handle how how do we negotiate the boundaries, right? So if we've got a set of rules and you've got a different set of rules, how do we negotiate that when we're going to interact with one another? And so that's what I would love to see for us, rather than this move toward universalization, um, globalization, which tends to be reductive, right? Which also would be would be my sense of the worst of theology and religion tends to be universalizing and reductive. And so here again, you've got an overlap between what theology can do and what we might be needing in the AI space. But so that's what I would want, is something more local, and building that direction rather than asking the question from the top and then having it trickle down.
When I look back at things like Gutenberg's printing press or the invention of radio, the invention of electricity, I do remember reading in my history books that this was always for each of these technologies that came along, people were up in arms, right? How is this going to change the world? What does it mean for me if this is going to be the case? How will we ever need to leave the house now if we have radio and we can hear people from across the world? Does it seem like that's kind of the status right now, is people are just kind of freaking out about the technology because they don't understand it? Or do you think that these fears are, for the first time, really correct, right? Like, should we be afraid? Should we have any concerns about not just the kind of nuanced ethical choices, but are there any fears that people really should have about being displaced, about losing our claim to the top of the hill in the food chain? I'm curious from the kind of psychological angle how you're thinking about that.
It's a great question, and I love your comparison to the printing press and other technologies like that. I think our approach is not to begin at the place of anxiety and fear when we have these conversations, because often it's hard to get out of those. On the one hand, I don't see AI as becoming something so different than what we've experienced before that we need to have a radically different approach to how we engage this as society, right? So it is new. There are new things emerging. We need to pay attention to that newness, right? We need to build capacities in as broadly as we can for folks to be able to use and engage these technologies and to have a voice into how they're going to be developed in the future, right? So, insofar as the building of these tools stays consolidated in a very small number of people, that could be difficult for society to be able to have much impact on how this goes going forward. Do I think AI will have an impact on society, and some of those impacts will be negative? Yes, we've already seen that. I mean, if we look at policing, for example, right, it's already exacerbated harm. That again, it's not necessarily new harm in quality, but it's new harm in quantity, right? And so if you think about policing, we think about warfare, we think about things that involve the people's lives, right? Um, there are ways in which this technology has a potential higher risk and cost than the printing press did, perhaps. Right now, the printing press had a massive impact on society, and people lost jobs, all this sort of stuff. So there are things we need to be paying attention to. We shouldn't just ignore and kind of look toward the positives and the hype, right? I think the approach I would hope for us is an approach of careful attention, and particularly careful attention to potential harms to communities who can't defend themselves, right? Who don't have access to be able to be a part of the conversation now. I think if we do that work, I think we have the real potential for AI to be more of a partner. And maybe that's the golden rule, Aro, is if we think about partnering with machines as partnering with difference and celebrating that difference, the rest, I think, will take care of itself.
I love that. So then it sounds like you're not sitting around at night worrying that the singularity is going to come in and lock your door and tell you that there's now a oh my God, what do they call it when you can't curfew, right? I think people have a lot of fears about AI like rising up, right? Like iRobot. And I don't think it's aided by things like Elon Musk's dancing person in a robot suit who, briefly convinced the world that they had made real robots that could take care of your children. And when you have those things happening at the same time that we're talking about hyper intelligence and pattern matching beyond the human ability, it's pretty easy to see why people start getting freaked out. So when you think about the folks who listen to this podcast, we have a pretty broad business audience, but we also have a lot of people involved in the privacy community. And when you think about privacy as a community, a lot of folks here, they started out in some technical role, or maybe they were attorneys by trade and they somehow got pulled into privacy through another path. Is there anything that you would recommend that a privacy professional who is in charge of governance at a company and data risk at a company, is there anything specific that you would recommend they do as kind of first steps for asking the question of, are we doing the right thing? What kinds of things do we look at to determine whether we're building trust or whether we're doing the right thing?
That's a beautiful question, Arlo. A couple of things I would suggest. One is get your hands dirty and play around with the tools that are emerging. I think privacy professionals, data professionals, we need these folks knowing what these AI tools do and can do and what they can't do, rather than just relying on what other people are telling us. And so find a friend or even on your own, take a tutorial or something, get your hands dirty and dig into these things, because then you'll have a sense of how to explore how to make the right kinds of decisions around these sorts of things. So that's one thing, get your hands dirty. Um, and I say that in every context I'm in, is let's play around with these things. And that's a big part of my job, is to create possibilities and conditions for folks to be able to play around and to learn about these things, so that it's not so foreign, it's not so other, right? That it is a thing that that I can actually encounter and then make some decisions around. So that's the first. The second, that I think is often a great place to start for a company or an organization or a person, is, do you have a good sense of what your values are? Do you have other processes already in existence where you do the alignment work of, hey, these are our core values as an organization or as a person, and here's how I put those core values into practice when I'm deciding this, or when we're hiring somebody, right? Do you already have an alignment process in place that looks closely at what your core values are and how you might make a decision about certain things? Use that, right? Tap into that already existing process you have, and then see how it can be translated into this particular space around how we relate to AI, how we use AI, and how the data and privacy are a part of that.
So, as we think about the dichotomy between innovation and regulation, we see that regulation is constantly struggling to keep up with the pace of technology. We've seen laws that have tried and failed. So, we saw California's law. We have seen the European AI Act come out. I would love to get a sense from you of, first off, do you feel like the regulations that are coming out are they directionally right? And then two, how do we balance? How do we decide whether to lean into innovation or whether to lean into ethics? Because it feels like, especially now, that maybe those two things aren't always aligned, meaning that the things that you have to do to get ahead in the AI race may present ethical challenges in the short term, but they might create ethical rights in the long term. I'm curious. So, big topic. I'd just love to hear your thoughts.
That's an important question, and I hope that we'll continue that conversation, because it's really pertinent right now. Like you said, there are many laws that haven't passed in the U.S. at least, and there's a difference between how the European Union is handling this and some other places are handling this in the U.S. So I think it's an important question. I think, let me take up the first question around, like, is the directionality of the regulation that is happening, does it seem to be in the right direction? I do think some of it is going in the right direction. So, for example, like NIST is proposing frameworks for uh, assessing AI risk right? And then requiring different levels of audit and analysis based on the risk of the particular use of the technology. I think that's smart. I think that's wise. I think that's a kind of framework that says, hey, we're not going to put everybody through the same level of scrutiny, right? If what you're doing is, using a generative AI model to write thank you letters for people who visited your history museum, like we're not going to subject that to the same kind of scrutiny around risk as we would. You're going to use AI to run drones with weapons on it or make decisions around parole or stuff that those have been in the news for a long, long time. So I think the fact that we are developing regulatory and legislative apparatus that can handle the different levels of risk. And I have had people say, right, but who's evaluating the level of risk? Excellent question, right? And I think that's where communities become important and professionals become important to be able to help folks do a really clear look at, okay, what is the real risk here, right? What are the potential risks? Back to the playing around. If you don't know what these tools can do, you have no idea what the risks can be. So I do think there is some trajectory that is good in terms of the type of regulation that is being built. In terms of the balance between innovation and regulation, which seems to be the kind of a key conversation going on in our own political context. I'll start by saying, fortunately for me and for many others, I am not making decisions about how we use weapons in warfare. That's a hard decision. I cannot imagine being the person who has to decide how we implement these sorts of tools and technologies in that kind of context. I was recently at a Library of Congress with a wonderful group of folks talking about the relationship between religion, technology, and politics and democracy. And we had some representatives there from the House talking about how some committees are having these sorts of conversations, which are really important. And again, a lot of the rhetoric was about protecting innovation, and so trying to keep the regulatory barriers down in order to allow businesses to continue to stay in front of the game in terms of the competition. My sense is, again, probably not the best person to speak to this in the larger frame, but my sense is that if we don't invest more in new modes of regulatory practice that can address uh, smaller contexts, local realms that don't have to be at a federal level that everybody has to respond to. But if we don't invest in new models of regulation that can protect communities that will be harmed if we don't do something, if we don't invest in that, I think we're in big trouble. It's been true in the past too. We've not done it in the name of innovation. Innovation for whom is a question we ought to ask, right? And if we're going to invest in innovation, that's awesome. Who's going to benefit? And if we don't do the governance and the regulation, who's getting harmed? And if we don't have people at the table asking those questions and continuing that tension, I think we're in trouble.
When you talk about the communities, this is just one other question I realized I had earlier. You mentioned community quite often during this conversation. I got to be honest, I'm not entirely sure what you mean when you say community. I think because community can mean a lot of different things. And I'm also really intrigued by the harm concept, right? I wonder if maybe you could give us some examples of where you think of a community that could be harmed by technology and AI, because I think those kind of more practical examples would be really helpful for people here to be able to understand how to think about that as well.
Yeah, I can try to give some examples of how communities can be harmed by AI. I'll start with maybe some less high stakes moving to higher stakes. I mean, one example would be, and this is in the news now, people are using AI to check for plagiarism that is being generated by AI. If you are a community for whom English is not your first language, you're much more likely to get flagged as cheating So there's an example of where a community could be more likely to be harmed by a use of AI than another community. Okay, so that's I mean, it's still not awesome. And in fact, I would just say uh, we should not be using AI checkers, AI plagiarism checkers. They just shouldn't be used. They're not good. Everybody in the industry is saying we shouldn't use them, other than the people selling them. Um, they're not working, right? So that's one example. Policing is another example, right? Police departments are using facial recognition technology to do all kinds of things in terms of crime prevention, right? We're probably all for crime prevention. That's probably a generic thing we're all for, right? The problem is we know for a fact that that almost all, if not all, of our computer vision technology struggles with certain skin tones and certain demographics of different biological features. And so it makes mistakes, and it's not as effective in certain communities, right? And so there will be people who will be flagged as risky or as having risky behaviors and needing to be policed more because of a use of AI that wasn't um, attended to in terms of the ethics, in terms of the potential harm. So there's a couple of examples how I could see communities being, and one of the positive examples we've thought about just as we've been imagining the world. So right now, self-driving cars are a thing most people are like, that's not actually going to happen, right? Um, we're going to have assisted driving cars, right, which we have now, right? But I mean, think about when I think about local communities, this is one of the tangible examples I think of is what if my, AI powered car, when I'm driving through different neighborhoods, and let's be honest, right? Many of our neighborhoods represent different communities, right? Different kinds of socioeconomics, different kinds of race, ethnicity, all that sort of thing, right? So often neighborhoods do function like that. That's why zip code becomes a proxy for socioeconomics and race, right? We don't collect that data. Actually, you do. You collect zip code, right? So, but what if I'm driving my car, right, my AI powered car, and that car is swapping its vision model based on a trained model for a given neighborhood. So rather than a generic model that's been, taken all the data from, all the states and all the cities around the US, right? And reduced its understanding of traffic. Now, I'm being a bit overly simplistic because these things are pretty well tuned on different, but what if we went down to the neighborhood level and said, you know what? When the car crosses a certain threshold, or even it's not that clear of a threshold, but the car is swapping models, right? And it's using local AI models that the community has some agency on how it's built to map what that community looks like, including how do people walk on the streets there? What are the patterns of traffic, of pedestrian traffic? What do pedestrians look like in this neighborhood? What kind of clothing do they wear, right? What are the kind of pets they have, right? And how do their pets work with them? So different neighborhoods have different norms and different cultures around that sort of thing. What if our self-driving car could swap models, right? So that's one example, Arlo, of what I mean by a local community. Could be a neighborhood, could be a school, could be a municipality, a city level rather than a federal level, right? Something like that. So, I mean, it could be, and then again, the challenging part around the local approach to this is how do you get these things interacting, right? That's the challenging part.
Those are great examples. We think about we've all read the news reports that say that people with darker skin are often flagged by generative AI and image recognition tools in ways that are bad or negative, and that will be a really interesting solution, right? Because even if you think about those models in slightly smaller, you're thinking about them in kind of little micro communities. Like I go from zip code to zip code. Should my vehicle or my phone think about things differently in this area? It's the same thing. If you make a model and you try and apply that American driving model to a Thai self-driving car, you're going to be in big trouble because they don't look behind them in Thailand, right? They drive differently. They look in front of them and they cut people off. So it is. That's just a brilliant concept that I haven't thought much about. So thanks for introducing me to that.
And maybe, Arlo, that gives us our second golden rule is there isn't one model to rule them all.
I think you might be right. This has been a big part of the topic of venture capitalists, right? Is have we seen the winners come out of AI? And a lot of people have bet that we've already seen those winners in Microsoft, Google, Facebook, and whoever else is developing AI. But if you are right, and this kind of smaller, localized model becomes a critical component for AI to make its way through the world effectively. Then the opportunities are going to be huge because there are going to be chances to build models for Texans and chances to build models for women, chances to build models for people who are underrepresented in some way to aid them in their challenges and struggles. It could end up being that everybody has their own model. So I don't think that the winners have been chosen yet.
I hope not, Arlo. I hope not. I hope we've got a long future of giving people a chance to win.
So, when you think about the kinds of things that you have to discuss in AI and privacy and ethics and data governance and in risk, it's pretty easy to get pretty scared of sharing any of your information anywhere. Right? I mean, we've all had our data breached and gotten that email from "Have I been pwned?" Or "Have I been owned?" I don't know how you're supposed to say it, but we all get those emails, and so we have rational reasons to be fearful. But it turns out that being involved in, data ethics, privacy does not preclude you from making lots of personal choices that you wouldn't recommend other people follow. So, put you under the gun here. We ask all of our guests, what is it that you do in your personal life that maybe you wouldn't recommend other folks follow?
First and foremost, I don't pay enough attention to what I'm sharing when I'm dealing with my own personal data. I just don't. I mean, I do this for a living. And so when I'm working for an organization, I look really closely at all the agreements and what people, what's being promised in terms of, but when I'm out there with my own data, I don't take the agency that I ought to take in order to be a data citizen. I don't do that. And I wish I did, and I think I should. But so I let stuff float out there that shouldn't float out there. I'm not paying attention in ways that I should be paying attention. And I also then sometimes I just avoid tools rather than learning the tool. And we better learn the tool, right? And participate in a community rather than just being like, that's too much work. Don't worry about it. So I think those are bad habits. I hope nobody follows those. I hope you be a data citizen. We need more data citizens. Pay attention to how your data is being used, and take agency with it.
Yeah, and the truth is, I think that we're all guilty of that. The click wrap agreements on the internet are awfully easy to say yes to, and I think even I have, I'm the CEO of a privacy company, and there have been plenty of times where I've clicked yes, here's my social security number so that I can watch this cat video. I get it. My social security number's already out there. I don't really care at this point in time. And I'm curious, on that topic, do you feel that people have, you raised it, and I also concur. We preach a lot about pay attention, look at where stuff is, but it's incredibly hard. It's just not realistic to read the terms and conditions for every single thing you're going to do. You'd spend your whole day doing that. Any solutions? Is there anything out there that you're thinking about that could address this topic of, I don't know, for lack of a better word, it's just kind of it's not laziness, but it's it's kind of a sense of overwhelm, right? Like I can go and read the terms and conditions. I can't really negotiate them. And so why bother reading them? I'm kind of curious what your take is on that.
Yeah, that's a great question, Arlo. And I mean, we've been in conversations both around that generically and around the consent models that get used in mental health space, for example, right? So if you think about, so we've done a lot of work with mental health organizations. Often a mental health organization, rightfully so, will be like, we have more and more people who need mental health and we don't have enough providers, right? We've got a supply problem. We'd like to use technology to help meet those needs. AI seems to be a great tool to use to do that. That's awesome. So they implement a tool. Many of those AI applications piggyback their consent on the consent that a person served gives to the mental health organization just for keeping their mental health record, right? Their electronic health record. So it's a piggyback consent. And so as a person served, right, at this agency, I might not have any idea about the consent I'm giving down the chain, right? Because of the kind of piggyback of consent. And so that's really and some folks in Denver have been doing some really great at WellPower have been doing some really great work trying to change the industry's consent model so that it's more transparent for folks when they do consent. What is it I'm actually consenting to? And at a level that's not a 7-page document, for one, right? Because you're right, if nobody's going to read that, right? So when it's not 7-page documents that we click I agree or not agree on, and two, not a one-time consent, right? So how do you get consent to be more granular and more just in time rather than the blanket consent of, hey, the first time you use this thing, we're going to take all your things, right? And then that's it, right? So it's a framework where consent and things like agreements for using my data will no longer be this thing to get passed, but it's actually built into the design of the user experience on a more regular basis. So I think that's a key thing that we've been seeing people start to explore. And the other piece for us, I think, is data citizenship, data literacy, right? Starting very young in schools, in families, in communities, where you're teaching folks what their empowerment really is, what their agency is with their data, so that the agreements no longer actually do the work that needs to be done because you've got 7-year-olds showing up saying like, don't give me a 7-page document. I know that I have the rights of these 4 things with my data. So how do I do that? So again, driving it from the kind of grassroots area of like, look, this is just not sufficient. We're not just going to protect ourselves from lawsuit, which is what the current model does, right? Current model is literally just to protect against litigation, right? This is actually no, we actually care about user agency, and so we're going to bake it into the design of the platforms.
I love the education angle because I think folks of our generation, we kind of the internet grew up with us as we hit adulthood. The internet became a big thing, and we were all taught that whatever you click is your problem, right? Caveat emptor. And we've taught that to our children. Right? I've taught my children, like, don't go to these kinds of websites. If somebody emails you, don't believe it's really them. And so we have had 25 years really of this kind of, this is how the world works. And now we have rights. And I think you're absolutely right. There is an element of education that has to be part of that. And whether that's governments or schools or private organizations or private public partnerships going out and saying we have to teach people about their rights, it's very impactful. Because we've seen a big increase in the past few years in people exercising those rights. And that increase of people exercising their rights through opting out of things or through requesting their data or requesting deletions, you can look at the topic of privacy in the news, and then you can look at the direct correlation of people increasingly exercising their rights. So people want those rights. They want to be able to exercise them, but we've made it so complicated. So I don't know if you're going towards like a nutrition label or something like that, but it feels like there should be something that you don't need a college education to be able to just make a quick game time call about whether this is red, yellow, or green.
Yeah, I love that idea, Arlo, in terms of simplicity of knowing what you're saying yes to, right? I think that's a great angle, and I think that's a challenge. I would say the education angle is and. It needs to be government and schools and family. It needs to be ands, not ors there. And we have talked a lot about labels. It's interesting. That's been in the mix for the last 5 or 6 years around even our trust model. We've had a number of agencies ask, why don't you turn the trust thing into a label so that somebody goes through your trust assessment review, they get a trust certification or a trust label, right, of certain levels or something like that. I think those things can be helpful. Um, as a industry, I mean, we see the LEED certification, things like this, right? I think they can be helpful, but I think your idea there, Arlo, of hey, look, can I tell red, yellow, or green? And based on the potential risk of this, can I make a decision? That feels like the direction that we got to get going, which will require a level of transparency um, that's currently not in our industry.
Yes, most people don't like transparency in their own businesses. They want everybody else to be transparent, but not them. Well, Michael, any final thoughts? Any takeaways? Anything that you'd like the audience to know?
One, I would just say I really appreciate privacy professionals. I think you're doing amazing work and translating privacy from the historical notions of what it meant into the world we're living in now is a really hard task. And I think it's an incredibly important task for the AI space as well. So I would just say thank you to privacy professionals. Um, I would also just encourage you all to get involved in the ethics conversation now. We're already behind, and we need your voice to speak to the conversation. It can't be just theologians. It can't be just philosophers for sure. And it's certainly not going to happen just in, you know, government or just in big business. We need your voice in the conversation, and I would love to be a part of that.
And like he mentioned earlier, those were two fantastic pieces of advice. Get out there and play with the technology. Even if your background is in law and you may not feel like you're a technologist, these tools are in the hands of everybody in America now. And if you're not using them to explore and learn, then you're missing out. And then that idea of going back to whatever your organization's core values are. That's great. I haven't heard that before, and I really like it. So Privacy Pros, those are two awesome takeaways that you've gotten today. Michael, thank you for your time.
Pleasure to be with you. Take care, everyone.
Thanks for listening to the Privacy Insider podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and go listen to prior episodes. If you have a little time, pick up a copy of the Privacy Insider book written by yours truly. And go to osano.com to find our newsletter, where you and 45,000 other privacy professionals and business professionals keep in touch with what is happening in privacy. Tune into our next episode, where we'll be doing a look back on 2024 as it impacted privacy, and looking forward to 2025 to try and predict the future. Let's see how that goes.